Hello again and welcome back for the final segment of Faces of Freedom. I'm Larry L., coming to you from Camp Blanding, Florida. From grenade training to certification on some of the military's most sophisticated weapons, Camp Blanding is one of the U.S. Army's elite training bases. It's here we continue the Villages Media Group's salute to America's frontline heroes. Few soldiers feel lucky to be heading into combat, but they all want luck on their side. For Don Edwards, fortune smiled on him more than once during a 21-year career that spanned 2 wars. Whether it was instinct or fate, he had an uncanny knack for survival. Technically, Don Edwards was training for combat, but storming the beaches in Hawaii wasn't real action. That changed with orders to Korea.
At that time, I kind of had a sense of adventure, okay, we'll see what happens. But that didn't last too long.
4 months into his tour, Edwards' 2nd Division was overwhelmed by waves of Chinese forces at the Yellow River.
They came at us. It didn't matter how many you knocked down, they just kept coming. 2nd and 3rd rank didn't even have weapons. They picked them up from those that got knocked down in the 1st rank,
During the fierce fighting, shrapnel penetrated Edwards' helmet, nailing it to his head. Not a debilitating wound, but his survival required a companion.
He was wounded in the leg and he couldn't hardly walk. And I was wounded in the head, and I couldn't get my helmet off to put a bandage on it. So the blood was running down in my face and had my vision fairly blocked. And so he was my eyes and I was his legs.
He made it to an aid station, but not home. The dire need for soldiers sent all able-bodied men back into combat.
I think I refocused and decided, well, they didn't get me this time, they're not going to get me the next time. So I think I was a little more aggressive at that point than I had been before.
Which led to more tests of his resilience. After being taken prisoner, he survived a cholera outbreak and 2 failed escape attempts before finally returning stateside. Safety he gave up 1 year later for duty at an air base in Vietnam, where regular rocket barrages threatened his life again.
Well, this one particular day, they were coming in hot and heavy. And Major Beam comes by my desk and he says, "Come on, we're going to the bunker." I said, "Nah, hell," I said, "it's all right." He says, "That's an order, we're going to the bunker." And one come in, hit right above my desk.
Edwards again tempted fate by volunteering as a helicopter door gunner and cheated death one final time when a restraining strap saved him from falling out. A lasting reminder of his mortality and perspective for the future.
Get up every day, thank the good Lord I'm here, and look forward to the day.
Edwards served 21 years in the Army. Likely it would have been more, but after learning he was scheduled for a 2nd tour in Vietnam, he retired. In December of 1944, Germany was facing defeat. American forces had driven the German army across France all the way back to the German border. Desperate to force a negotiated peace on the Western Front, the Nazis launched one last all-out offensive through the Ardennes forest. It was the last place the Americans were expecting an attack, and their lines were thin. For the next month, the Battle of the Bulge raged. More than 1 million soldiers fought to a stalemate on the frigid and snow-covered battlefield. For the Americans, it was a victory. Germany had nothing left. For American soldier Isidore Oberman, it was both a life-threatening and life-saving chapter in his life story. Stephen Reynolds has more.
I did it for my folks back home, my fellow man back home, our way of life.
Isidore Oberman's memory of service to country begins in December 1944 at the Battle of the Bulge. Crucial to the Allied defense, they had no choice but to hold the line. It was here, in the town of Bastogne, that the 19-year-old soldier had to grow up quickly.
Scared is all I can say, especially after I saw my first dead GI. I just kept seeing myself laying there instead of that guy, and I was scared.
Unharmed, Izzy left Bastogne behind, but not the danger. His armored division pursued the German army into the town of Ittenbach.
I was behind the tank. We were closing in on some Germans. All of a sudden, an artillery shell hit the tank and started burning inside. I pulled one out, and my buddies pulled the other guy out, and we dropped them onto the ground where there was some water, some puddles.
He earned a Bronze Star for saving his brothers in arms, and to this day, they remain anonymous.
Never saw them again. They were my buddies. Didn't know them, but they were my buddies.
But shortly after his heroics, Izzy needed a rescue of his own.
In the afternoon, I got shot with a bullet in the cemetery.
From across a field, a sniper found Izzy in his crosshairs.
I took refuge behind that tombstone there, and I felt relieved. The guy couldn't get at me. He was shooting at me, but he couldn't get at me.
For his injury at Ittenbach, Izzy was given the Purple Heart and a trip home, leaving the war and the fear behind him.
When they started shooting at me, that's when I stopped being scared.
Izzy left the horrors of war on the battlefield, but the memory of those days remain, as do the reasons why he is so proud to have served.
I think it made me a better man. Serving in the war, serving the American people. We did the job we were asked to do. We gave it our best. We survived. For that, we are very thankful.
Izzy's last duty to his country was to pass his experiences on to his grandchildren and leave behind a legacy for which they could be proud. Up next, we go to war in the thick jungles of the Pacific, where Private James Skinner and American forces launch a counteroffensive known as island hopping. But first, another American frontline hero.
I am Philip Livingston. I was a petty officer in the United States Navy. My medical unit was the first to touch down in Bahrain in preparations for Operation Desert Shield, the Desert Storm.
Welcome back to Faces of Freedom. I'm Larry L. We are coming to you from Camp Blanding, Florida, where our nation's soldiers train for combat, including qualifying on the firing range with the .50 caliber machine gun. We continue now with the Village's Media Group salute to America's frontline heroes. To win the war in the Pacific, the United States had to be able to strike at the heart of Japan, but getting close enough to launch an offensive depended on an unconventional strategy known as island hopping. U.S. forces would bypass heavily defended Japanese positions and concentrate on strategically important but lesser defended islands. 3 of them were Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and Guam. And as Christine Eschenfelder tells us, setting foot on each of them was Marine Private James Skinner.
The jungles of Guadalcanal prepared young Marine James Skinner for Bougainville, where he survived 19 cases of malaria, jaundice, and jungle rot. But as illness was Skinner's enemy on Bougainville, it was no comparison to what he would face on Guam. Skinner and a fellow Marine were canvassing the area around a cave.
I saw this big pair of binoculars down there, and Boyd and I decided we were going to go in, and he was going to grab them. I said, Boyd, don't. There might be booby traps. Something's wrong here. And I took the flashlight and I come out just into his face right there from here to him. He was up in the hole, bang, he threw the grenade, and I hollered to Boyd. Well, I guess I was so close that it scalped me. That's what it did. I get hit in the hands in different places.
Another brush with death came on Iwo Jima.
I was a demolition man, so one of the things that we did was blow up caves, and I learned on the job, seriously. There was a shell hole in what we called the sulfur pits. The sulfur pits were where maybe a big shell hit down, and the sulfur pits, you could lie in there, it was warm. You could even heat a can of beans up or anything else. That's how nice it was.
The sulfur pits were popular. Skinner says on one occasion, he and 2 others left the hole to go on patrol. When they came back, it was occupied.
I said, you can't stay in there, that's our hole. Oh, no, 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 we're not gonna get out, we're here first. You have no, don't pull your rank on me, Skinner, you know, they were saying like that. And Zahn says, okay, we'll flip for it. And I says, okay, that's fair enough. We flipped. I lost, but I won. Let's put it that way. The next morning, a shell hit in there and killed all 3 of them.
Since the war, Skinner's been to several reunions. As a Marine veteran, he was invited to the 2005 Super Bowl.
Well, I hate to say it right now. I wonder whether it's all worth it, the way the world's going and whatever's happening right now. Everybody should share in it. It's not like World War II where everybody shared in everything. It was a different ballgame then.
Among Skinner's honors is the Purple Heart. Still to come on Faces of Freedom, fighting in Vietnam and serving at the Pentagon on 9/11, the story of Frank Cook. But first, as we head to break, here's another frontline hero.
My name is Felix Ladkins. As a chief warrant officer in the Army during the Vietnam War, I was wounded when my helicopter took gunfire through the floorboard, hitting me in the leg. I earned the Purple Heart and the Bronze Star for service to my country.
Welcome back to Faces of Freedom, the Village's media group's salute to America's frontline heroes. I'm Larry L. Some may ignore it, others even use it to their advantage. But for soldiers serving in combat, fear is something they all have to live with. Time spent in uniform carries with it the constant threat of danger. Army Colonel Frank Cook was prepared for the threats as a platoon leader in Vietnam. And as Kevin Coughlin reports, his readiness served him well when attack was least expected.
Fear. Frank Cook knows all about it. After serving in Vietnam as platoon leader for the 101st Airborne Infantry's 1st Battalion.
There was a time that I was laying behind a tree root, and I turned to tell some soldiers to do something, and I looked back and the tree root was cut off right there. And so had my head been up instead of down, I would have been dead. I've never been so afraid in my entire life. So when I say that I know about fear and terror and panic, I know. I don't think I found anything in Vietnam that I didn't expect to find. What I did find was a lot about myself.
Cook would later work as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Reserved Affairs in Washington, D.C. Months before his retirement, Cook would be faced with yet another terrifying experience on September 11, 2001, when terrorists crashed a plane into the Pentagon.
I was actually walking from my office toward where the plane hit, when the plane hit, and it felt no more than just kind of a bump. Right after the plane hit, when there were people running away, I mean, doing what you should do, which is evacuate. And you know, a bomb goes off somewhere near you, you get your butt out of there. And so you want to call that panic? Okay. You want to call that good sense? Well, okay, that's probably right too.
And it was where the plane hit that made Cook realize he was lucky to be alive. The plane crashed where his office would have been. But because of renovations made to the Pentagon at the time, Cook's office was moved to another wing of the building.
Had the plane hit there at another time, after we'd moved in or before we moved out, that number may have been 1,000. We were tremendously lucky as a nation, and that's a terrible thing to say, but for those of us who weren't there when it happened, there's a lot of us, a whole bunch of us. We just don't know who we are.
Cook would retire soon after as a colonel, serving for almost 35 years. During that time, realizing fear, realizing he was fortunate.
Sometimes you're very lucky, and I was one of the lucky ones.
Cook's daughter is currently serving her country as a nurse at a combat support hospital in Afghanistan. She expected to return home in January. When Faces of Freedom continues, battling the cold and the Chinese army in Korea at the age of 18, the story of Larry Schilling. But first, here's another face to thank for our freedom.
My name is Ralph Hoffman, a United States Marine during the Korean War. I earned the Purple Heart for my service during the Battle of Field 676 and took shrapnel to the face and chest.
Welcome back to Faces of Freedom. I'm Larry L. We are at Camp Blanding and looking at the base's confidence course, where soldiers build physical endurance and stamina. Just a few of the many tools they will need when and if they are ever called to combat. On June 25th, 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, and the young Cold War suddenly turned hot and bloody. While lasting just over 3 years, Korea, like most wars, etched lasting images into the minds of the soldiers who did the fighting. For one particular soldier, the memories are especially vivid of the long, cold nights dug into his foxhole as the Chinese army bombarded his position with mortar and gunfire. Those images still haunt Corporal Larry Schilling to this day. Susan Koljasar has more.
As a patriotic young man, after basic training in Fort Riley, Kansas, Larry Schilling headed off to Korea in 1951 as part of the 25th Division.
I was so proud that I was on a tank, you know, from being a kid, you see all these tanks, and that was my dream, to get on the top of a tank.
His dream of combat action was about to begin in an exotic foreign country.
And I'm standing there looking at it, and I'm thinking, God, this is beautiful, you know. And right along the side of the road, there's a little gully. And Chinese jumped up, shot right at me from, I'd say, 10 feet away or less. Hit the tank, scared the hell out of me.
I didn't do anything. I didn't even shoot at the guy. I was, you know, I couldn't believe it.
That was his first day in Korea, but the following days would prove to be more harsh than beautiful, which led to many nights of prayer, including the night before he turned 19.
I gotta hit 12 o'clock. And if I make it to 12, I tell these guys, I'll live. And if I don't, I'll be dead anyway. I made it.
Through that night and the harsh winter months ahead, bitter temperatures and poor supplies made combat nearly impossible. He would run matches over his practically frozen hands so his finger could pull the trigger.
If you're up in some of those mountains, it was almost 40 below zero.
After enduring those kinds of conditions, Schilling still has a positive outlook on his Korean War experience. He was awarded several honors, including a Korean Service Medal with 3 stars, a National Defense Service Medal, and a Combat Infantry Badge.
When I got to Korea and got off the boat and saw all of this, I was thrilled to death. This was combat. And I was just gung-ho. It's something I wanted the most of my life. I spent 3 years in the military, and it was one of those experiences that most people will never have their life.
Experiences that helped make Larry Schilling who he is today.
Larry Schilling was honorably discharged from the United States Army in 1953. And to this day, he says he can't sleep with the windows open because he sees enemy troops coming through them. When Faces of Freedom continues, training South Vietnamese soldiers in offensive and defensive tactics, the role of Captain Howard Lovering. And now, here is another American frontline hero dedicated to freedom.
My name is Richard Johnson. I was a paratrooper in the United States Army. My first jump was over Normandy on D-Day. I also fought in the Battle of the Bulge.
Welcome back to Faces of Freedom. We continue our look at America's frontline heroes from Camp Blanding, a U.S. Army training base where soldiers learn and practice for combat situations like jungle warfare. In 1954, President Dwight D. Eisenhower promised the South Vietnamese government the United States would support its efforts to ensure a non-communist South Vietnam. By 1955, he backed up that pledge by sending aid and American advisors to train the South Vietnamese Army. In order to teach them infantry tactics, the U.S. advisors often went on missions with the soldiers, instantly becoming the enemy and targets for North Vietnamese troops. As Rebecca Underwood explains, that was the case for Captain Butch Lovering.
When serving overseas, many soldiers rely on their fellow servicemen and women to be their family. But some serving in Vietnam got to live with an actual family during their tour. The Mobile Advisory Team was a small group of 5 Americans and a translator, living with a Vietnamese soldier and his loved ones.
They found that the Vietnamese would fight much better if they had their families with them.
Howard Butch Lovering was part of this group responsible for an area of operations in the Dong Co Qui village to advise and take care of regional force troops.
We were supposed to keep this area of operations peaceful, which was not easy because we're in Dong Co Qui village, which was about 150 meters from the Cambodian border.
In 1969, American and Vietnamese soldiers could only pursue an enemy 1,000 meters into Cambodia before having to retreat.
What the Viet Cong would do is hit us from Cambodia with mortars or whatever they could muster up, and then use that as a refuge because we couldn't really go after them.
They could, however, go after Viet Cong soldiers taking over Vietnamese villages. Lovering recalls one mission to gather 6 enemy leaders who would be responsible for ruling a seized village. His team would be the first into this territory heavily occupied by Viet Cong.
We picked up, I think we had 4 of them, and then all of a sudden, all craziness went kaflooey. We had, weapons going off in houses and huts, and so we had the group of, we had 4 at the time that we were protecting because of this firing going back and forth. That stopped. We picked up 2 more, and now we had to get out of there.
And to do that, the men had to cross a lake on their way back to safety.
So we were out in the middle of the lake, and we called for artillery to cover us so we could get across in these little dugout canoes, little fat-bodied Americans. It was like wobbling around, and we were scared more out. So what they did was they put up flares. So now everybody could see us. So that was pretty scary. And luckily, the VC hadn't got to that village and reacting. So we did get out of there, but and brought the 6 prisoners back.
After serving his tour in Vietnam, Lovering was awarded a Combat Infantry Badge, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Vietnam Campaign Ribbon.
During his time in Vietnam, Lovering became close friends with his translator. There was even talk of him moving to the United States, but the two eventually lost contact. Still to come, storming Omaha Beach on D-Day with Army Sergeant Larry Lederman when America's Frontline Heroes returns. But first, here are more Faces of Freedom.
I'm Bob Luco. I was a Petty Officer 2nd Class in the United States Coast Guard and as a Staff Sergeant in the U.S. Air Force during the Korean War. I was assigned to a B-29 bomber crew as an electronics countermeasure operator.
I am Ron Durian, a retired Colonel, United States Army. I served in Vietnam in the U.S. 25th Infantry Division. I was awarded the Bronze Star, which is given for combat heroism.
Welcome back to Faces of Freedom, America's Frontline Heroes. I'm Larry L. It was called Operation Overlord, better known as the Invasion of Normandy or D-Day. By any name, it was a decisive battle in the war in Western Europe, as D-Day proved to be a psychological and physical blow to the German military, one from which it would never recover. The landing at Omaha Beach by American forces had many obstacles to overcome, and no one knows that better than Sergeant Larry Lederman. Jessica Kiss has his story.
Yours is not a question why, yours is what to do or die.
No amount of training could emotionally prepare then 20-year-old Larry Lederman for the nightmare he would live to remember.
At H hour, the infantry was to go in, and 3 minutes after that, we were to follow. Unbeknown to all of us, there was a crack division of Germans high on the hills on the beach.
As a member of the U.S. Army's 146th Engineer Combat Battalion, Lederman's role on Omaha Beach was to drive an M29 Weasel, a small, unarmored tank-like vehicle, and deliver additional explosives to infantry soldiers. But as Lederman quickly realized, the situation ashore called for different measures.
And it was just chaos. Everything certainly didn't go according to plan, and the fire was tremendous, hitting the beaches, and it was a sight. Yeah. In fact, at the time was so shocking.
The minefield the Germans had in place was also extensive. Amid machine gun, rifle, and sniper fire, an officer told Lederman to detonate mines. He managed 2 before receiving different orders from another officer.
And he said, "What are you doing? That's suicide." He said, "Stop."
Soon after that, Lederman was reunited with Assistant Division Engineer Captain James Doyle. At his request, the two traveled west in the Weasel to pick up orders from the battalion commander. The plan appeared logical, but executing it would sear a painful memory in Lederman forever.
I had one body start floating by, and I reached over to push the body. Captain Doyle, he yelled at me. He said, "For God's sakes, run over them. They're dead."
It's estimated 2,400 American lives were lost on D-Day, 35 from Lederman's battalion. Allied forces won the Battle of Normandy, not through the execution of a flawless plan, but through bravery displayed by men like Larry Lederman.
I feel that the true heroes in the war really are dead.
As Jessica said, there are no official casualty figures for D-Day. However, it is estimated that more than 425,000 Allied and German troops were killed, wounded, or missing during the battle. Larry Lederman escaped the invasion of Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge with a single small shrapnel wound. That will bring to a close our salute to American heroism. We hope you've enjoyed meeting the men and women who served with gallantry, fortitude, and selflessness as much as we have. Like their forebearers at Valley Forge, Gettysburg, and the Marne, these soldiers' actions helped define a nation. Their legacy will serve as an example for current and future generations. In their own minds, most don't consider themselves heroes, but in the hearts of their countrymen, their commitment to higher ideals set them apart as faces of freedom. For the Villages Media Group, I'm Larry L. Thank you for joining us.
Faces of Freedom, America's Frontline Heroes, was presented by the Villages Media Group in partnership with Properties of the Villages and Comcast.